I've been saying this for years, that the Giza Plateau is so much more than just the three Great Pyramids. When you arrive in Egypt, the pyramids absolutely dominate the skyline, and while you're standing at the base of them, it's hard not to gaze up towards the top. But as you walk around the Giza Plateau and try not to trip over every nook and cranny, you will notice that there are shafts and tunnels that lead down to elaborate labyrinths all throughout the Giza Plateau. I often tell people that I travel with, think of Giza as a honeycomb. It's almost as much void as it is bedrock beneath the pyramids. And for everything that's a little bit questionable about this new SARS scan that's come out in relation to the Khafre Pyramid, what it has done is highlight this fact that there is so much more to the Giza Plateau than just the three Great Pyramids. And this was never more evident to me than when I was finally able to visit Giza. If you haven't been to Egypt, it can be hard, if not impossible, to get a real grasp on the size and scale and the massiveness of the pyramids, let alone everything that's around the pyramids, such as the mortuary temples or this large basalt floor that sits at the base of Khufu's pyramid, or the various mastabas and funerary buildings scattered all throughout the site. It's an incredibly dense archaeological site. And it's not without proper cause that the pyramids take up so much of the limelight, but it does tend to drown out some of the other thought-provoking and compelling aspects of the Giza Plateau, of which other scholars and independent researchers may find even more interesting than the pyramids themselves. One of my favorite aspects about Giza is the Valley Temple at the base of Khafre's complex, sitting just next to the Sphinx. These huge cyclopean red granite stones that are perfectly hewn and fit together. It's absolutely amazing and really one of a kind even in Egypt itself. When you look at everything that's in Khafre's complex, including the Sphinx Temple, the Valley Temple, and the Sphinx itself, the Pyramid of Khafre, the middle pyramid sitting up in the middle of the Giza Plateau, actually sort of fades in the background and is the least interesting part of that entire complex. I find that when I'm standing outside of the Valley Temple and I'm looking at the docks where this tributary of the ancient Nile ran right up to the Valley Temple and the Sphinx Temple, and you had the pyramids overlooking it, I find that imagery of what ancient Egypt must have looked like during its heyday to be incredibly evocative. And in some ways, that's really only something that you can get a grasp on by visiting Egypt. When you visit Giza, it's hard not to have your eyes constantly gazing up towards these gigantic pyramids cutting through the sky. Even at their youngest date of around 4,500 years ago, they are still the most massive buildings ever built. And this was all being done while most of the rest of the world was still toying with sticks and living in thatch and wood huts. We find the pyramid strange because it challenges us to contemplate and comprehend a reason to build something that is still the heaviest building in the world at around 6 million or more tons. Even the oversimplified explanations of the pyramids just being tombs must be an understatement. They must be more than just that. But today we're going to talk about the other element of Giza. Most people don't realize that around 70 to 80% of Giza's archaeological site is actually below your feet. There are an incredible amount of buildings on the Giza Plateau that are continually being buried by the desert sand, some of which were known of and excavated over a century ago and have been lost to the sands of time since then. Archaeologists do not know where some of these mastabas exist today. And if you decide to tread off the beaten path around the southern end of the plateau, it can quickly become very dangerous. I spent some time scampering around these long shafts that seem to just fall off into nowhere, and no matter how close I got to the edge, peering down into the bottom, it was nothing but darkness. I could never see the bottom. We know that since at least around 3000 BC, during Dynasty 1 or 2, the Egyptians were using the plateau and cutting out rock-cut shaft tombs, and this would actually continue beyond the next 3000 years, well into the Roman period. There's even evidence of Romans arriving at the Giza Plateau, even Greeks and Persians before them, and removing Egyptian bodies to have themselves buried at the foot of the pyramids. So the Giza Plateau was continuously being used for thousands of years here. And I'll say this later in the video, but it is just layer upon layer of archaeological nuance and context. And all of this nuance and these layers make it hard sometimes to decipher the original use and meaning of not only just sites at the Giza Plateau, but all throughout Egypt. So in today's presentation, we're going to dive into the Giza underworld, what we know, what we don't know, and my hope is that by the end of this presentation, you'll have a better appreciation and understanding of everything that exists below the pyramids and everything else that is around the pyramids on the Giza Plateau. A couple of months ago, I ventured down the long descending passage within the Great Pyramid. It was about midnight. The Giza Plateau was closed, and it was a very surreal and personal experience. The countless centuries that these stones had sat in darkness, and now I was there within the lowest depths of the pyramid itself, it was a profound feeling. And a great irony about the subterranean chamber that sits below the pyramid is that in its incomplete state, it tells us so much more about the workmen and the methods by which the rock-cut portion of the pyramid was carved out than a finished portion of the pyramid would. But at the same time, this also leaves us with absolutely no clue as to what the subterranean chamber was intended to be used for. The chamber itself is incomplete, with only about half of it being fully cut and quarried away. One theory is that the descending passage in the subterranean chamber may actually be older than the pyramid itself, or at least were cut out before the foundation of the pyramid had been laid. Another idea is that the subterranean levels were being cut out alongside the construction of the pyramid, but as the height of the pyramid increased, it became too difficult to constantly haul out the stone that was being cut and chipped away, so work on the subterranean levels were never finished. Now, I proposed this in a previous presentation, but I don't actually think that the subterranean level was intended to be the burial site. In the time that I've spent studying the 4th dynasty, what I think we're seeing is a change from the 3rd into the 4th of pharaohs now seeing themselves as not just being the high priest of their god, but now ascending to become an amalgamation of the god itself, or a conduit of the god's power, a physical embodiment of the god himself. And so I wonder if these burial chambers that are high above ground, over 100 feet above ground, I wonder if this is not the pharaoh saying, unlike the rest of the Egyptians being buried alongside me, who are all being buried in the subterranean levels inside the ground, I am the living embodiment and the power of a god. Therefore, I must be buried above ground. I think that we may be seeing some kind of psychological change here, but that's just my guess. Now, I think I should take a moment and address this popular narrative idea of the pyramids being tombs. I mean, this is what the vast majority of people have just accepted for thousands of years. And a lot of people, at least in the modern day, don't like this idea. It is hard for us to comprehend such a great feat being worthy of one man's tomb, or one man's tomb being worthy of such a great feat of labor and economic expense and true genius. And in fact, perhaps he was not worthy of all of this. But we are not dealing with people who saw the world in any way similar to us. This concept of practicality, reason, and function taking far more importance over things such as religion was given to us by the Greeks, who in the 5th century BC began to suggest that the gods may not even be involved in our day-to-day lives, and began placing a far higher importance on how a man can control his own life. But even then, this wasn't received well by most. The ancient world was still an extremely pious, which means devoutly religious. These were extremely devoutly religious people who paid the highest attention to showing respect and paying tribute to their gods. And the Athenian philosopher Socrates was sentenced to execution by the court of Athens for supposing that the gods may not even be involved with their lives, as well as passing these ideas on to the youth of the city. This Socratic way of thinking that really we all have in the first world in the 21st century is something that was given to us by the Greeks, and it began about 2,500 years ago and slowly eked its way out into the Western world. But as we cross that threshold beyond the 5th century in Greece, we move into an entirely different chapter in human history. These are not people who thought and viewed the world really in any way similar to us. The way that they explained their realm, the way they explained the natural world and science was mostly through religion. And especially the Egyptians, who Herodotus, who is a 5th century Greek traveler visiting the Egyptians, he said that the Egyptians were even more devoutly religious than the Greeks. It was something that was even shocking to him. Now, you have to remember, the Greeks were so pious that they sentenced Socrates to death in 399 BC. So how much more religious could the Egyptians have been? So they viewed their pharaoh as the literal, physical embodiment of the high god, whichever patron deity it is during this era. During the 4th dynasty, it would have been the god Ra. This is the kingdom of the sun god. So we have to realize that we cannot impress upon the ancient Egyptians our standards of what we think is reasonable in the modern world, because we are dealing with people who are almost nothing like us. And really, that's what makes them so fascinating. And once I understood this, it made the study of the Egyptians so much more gratifying, so much more deep, so much juicier, because you're studying people who are so different than us. When you finally grasp this, it opens up your mind to an entirely new realm of possibilities. The Osiris Shaft. For nearly 2,500 years, the mystery of what lies at the bottom of the Osiris Shaft has been shrouded in legend. Even the Greek traveler Herodotus visited the shaft in the mid-5th century BC and was told by locals that somewhere at the bottom were the remains of a great ancient king who was buried on an island surrounded by water. Now, in preparing this part of the presentation on the Osiris Shaft, of which really there's not a lot written about this, I came across a paper published in 2007 called The Discovery of the Osiris Shaft at Giza, where Zahi Hawass essentially takes sole credit for the most current excavations and surveys done at the Osiris Shaft, calling it one of his most important discoveries at Giza. Anyway, for centuries, the Osiris Shaft had been used as a swimming hole, and even a location where people who visiting the Giza Plateau would stop and drink fresh water that was coming up from the ground. And it's odd, for as famous and mythical and legendary as this feature at the Giza Plateau is, very little contextually is actually known about when the Osiris Shaft was cut out and what exactly it was used for. And most tourists, as they descend down the causeway from the middle pyramid, they may walk right over the entrance of the Osiris Shaft. It takes a trained eye or somebody who knows what they're looking for to not miss it. The known portions of the underground structure consist of 3 different levels, the center and lowest levels being the most significant. The center level consists of a large open room with several adjoining chambers, along with a 3rd vertical shaft which descends down into the lowest level. It's here that archaeologists discovered a clearly very important burial site, which is raised from the floor and may have once been flooded around its base, which could resemble the island and lake that Herodotus had written about 2,400 years earlier. And in the early 1900s, some young Egyptians were lowered down into the shaft to collect and bring up artifacts from the material recovered. The earliest artifacts dated to the reign of 6th dynasty pharaohs, and it is largely from these findings that the earliest use of the Osiris Shaft is dated to Dynasty 6, which would be around 2350 BC. But artifacts dating all the way down to the 21st and 22nd dynasties have been discovered as well, which tells us that this Osiris Shaft had been open for centuries upon centuries. Now, there are many ideas regarding what the Osiris Shaft had been used for, but to me, something about it seems similar to the Osirion, a very large, laboriously constructed structure used as maybe a symbolic location for the mystery cult of Osiris, the god of death. The rituals and initiations performed within these mystery cults must have been a tightly kept secret, likely punishable by death, as the later Greek mystery cults also were, as their inner workings and proceedings were never divulged in ancient times and remain one of the most elusive, romantic, and compelling mysteries of the ancient world. And it's my thought that whatever was taking place in these processions, whatever was being revealed to the cult members of this Osiris cult, was so valuable and so safeguarded and coveted that it needed to be protected for all eternity. It's my personal hunch that whatever was taking place in the Osiris Shaft is either tangentially connected to or akin or very similar to the use of the Osirion. The boat pits. As you're standing around the base of the Great Pyramid, you're likely to eventually notice this huge gash in the ground. And found in these gashes were the remains of royal boats, whose boards were sewn together with rope in ancient times. They are not very substantial constructions, and indeed they may have never actually been sailed on the Nile River. But these are called solar boats, and it's thought that their purpose is to be used by the resurrected pharaoh in the afterlife. Now, this may sound silly to us at first, but let's imagine the Egyptian perspective. The only way of transportation in this ancient realm is by boat. This is long before the arrival of horses or camels into Egypt. And you're not walking through the desert or along the oasis to get to where you need to go, because it's not as easy to get anywhere as it is by sailing up and down the river. The river is also the central component to all of life in the ancient Nile, as it gives life to everything along the Nile. They also closely followed the path of the sun, whose divinity is even noticed and worshipped by the blue lotus flower, which rises up from the depths of the Nile, blooms in the midday sun to worship the sun, and then closes and goes back down into the murky underworld of the Nile every single day. These two things they would have noticed, and they would have either one came first or the other, but they would have noticed this flower worshiping the sun every day. So they're worshiping the Nile, they're worshiping this flower, or at least venerating this flower, and they're certainly worshiping the sun, as we have a plethora of sun gods in Egypt, most notably being Ra, and then later the Aten. And when the sun went down, they noticed the Milky Way, and it was their thought that when the sun goes down on the western horizon and it rises the next morning in the east, what it is doing is, as it goes down, it is riding the path of the Milky Way across the night sky. So they thought that there was another Nile River in the sky. What they're doing is they're looking at their natural world and using it to somehow explain solar, celestial, cosmic phenomena in the sky above them. And eventually, somewhere along the way, it became the belief of the priesthood and of the pharaoh himself, who is, of course, the head of the priesthood, that in his next life or in the afterlife, he would need a boat to join the sun god Ra in riding across the Milky Way or across the universe for all of eternity. Or all of that could be wrong, as it's just an interpretation of very scant, rare, and extremely ancient archaeological evidence that only gives us a slim glimpse into the belief of the priesthood or the royal court in Egypt's 4th dynasty. The workers' graves. Higher up on the Giza plateau, sitting at the base of the pyramids, are the mastaba graves for the overseers of the pharaoh's state projects, a large portion of which must have been the pyramids, but we also have to imagine that state-sponsored public and private buildings in Memphis and Thebes must have been built as well. Hemiunu held the title of overseer of all the king's works during the reign of Khufu, and it seems fitting that he would be given such a large burial site. However, just at the bottom of the plateau, we find the lower-ranking officials and workmen under Hemiunu. These are known as the workers' tombs. These tombs range from different varieties. Some are rock-cut burials with causeways leading up from the Nile. Others are simple sandpit burials and even egg dome tombs, a peculiar mud brick vaulted tomb with the deceased being placed in the fetal position inside. This may be hearkening back to the primordial mound of regeneration, or at least I think that when we see people being buried in this fetal position, it's a representation of their hope of being reborn in the next life. And this egg-shaped dome tomb that's over them, I think, is representative of their mother's womb. All along the Nile, throughout Egypt's 3,000-year reign, non-royal Egyptians painted scenes of everyday life on their tomb walls. Fishing, sailing, singing, dancing, playing instruments, drinking beer and wine. Egyptians loved their life along this fertile oasis, and they painted these scenes on their tomb walls as a statement of what they intended to do in the next life. So it makes sense to me that this mud brick egg dome tomb in the Egyptian mind is going to somehow magically turn into their mother's womb in the next life as they begin their next journey. That's just my theory. From the bodies that we found in these workers' tombs, we can tell that their lives were shorter than that of their noble counterparts, and they worked themselves to the bones. Fractures in the arms and legs, as well as back problems, are found all throughout the workers' bodies. Even though the Egyptians were master stonemasons who had developed ingenious methods of moving, cutting, and lifting megaliths in ways that we still can't understand nearly 5,000 years later, this still must have been very hard and grueling work. And this actually disproves this popular idea or this notion by people who I suppose, don't know a lot about Egypt that say that the pyramids must have been built with slave labor. No, these were people who were being paid and were being honored greatly by being allowed to be buried on the Giza Plateau at the footsteps of the living God because of the work that they endured to help this living God build his tomb that would last for all of eternity. Caves beneath Giza. During the height of World War II, air raid anxieties were high. The entire world had seen the bombing that London had endured and would soon see the destruction of Western Europe as the United States joined Great Britain in claiming air superiority over the Germans. And even with the Axis powers knocking on the door of Northern Africa, excavations and research at Giza continued. Archaeologists working at Giza during the war were, of course, and understandably paranoid that the pyramids might become a target of the Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force. So they had to devise and identify safe places for them to retreat to, or in other words, bomb shelters on the Giza Plateau that they may be able to quickly get to if something like this were to happen, as, well, there's no warning for an air raid. One of the places identified as a good bomb shelter were the tombs of the Northern Cliff, which sit just west of the Great Pyramid and face north. The front tomb chambers were mapped out during the war, and it was labeled as an 18th dynasty tomb, meaning around 1400 BC, but no specific reason for this date was actually given. However, the interior certainly resembles the other rock-cut tombs dating back to the Old Kingdom that I've seen down in Aswan. But there was another feature of these tombs that the original researchers, for whatever reason, didn't document. The tomb builders broke into a natural labyrinth that stretches out more than 300 meters below the Giza Plateau. The interior of the cave system is of course very rough, but some of the walls do appear to have been worked. Now, artifacts that were found within the tomb seem to only date to around the late period, which means anywhere from around 1000 BC, dynasty 21 to 22, all the way down to the early Roman period. And this is because Latin inscriptions were actually found on the ceiling of one of the first adjoining chambers. But it should of course be said that the lack of Old Kingdom artifacts does not mean that this is not an Old Kingdom or even older rock-cut tomb, as it's perfectly possible that later Egyptians during the New Kingdom, the late period, Persians, Greeks, or even Romans didn't come into this rock-cut tomb and remove everything, as it would have been just as valuable to them as well. One of the artifacts found in this tomb is the wooden winged bird statue, which many have proposed may be evidence of aerodynamics thousands of years earlier than previously thought. And it's not hard to imagine that you could throw this little bird and it flies somewhat like a paper airplane. Although Egyptologists have made a rather quick point to say that this is utter nonsense, I do wonder if it's ever been tried. The Khafre Pyramid scans, 1960s to 2025. Back in the 1960s, an American physicist named Luis Alvarez, who'd worked under Oppenheimer on the Manhattan Project during World War II, was given special permission to perform a muon tomography test on Khafre's pyramid, the middle pyramid. Muon tomography is a technique that sends out cosmic ray muons, which can penetrate through hard surfaces, find voids, and generate either 2D or 3D images of the void as well as its volume. It sounds like science fiction, but this existed even in the 1960s. The process was slow, and after 3 years of scanning the pyramid from the bottom directly up, as well as the shallow bedrock surrounding the known chambers, Alvarez reported that no known voids had been detected in either the 19% of the pyramid they had scanned or the surrounding bedrock. Then, in 1977, the Stanford Research Institute returned to the Khafre Pyramid to instead scan straight into the bedrock, and it was here that they found a very strong signal of two chambers, one at a depth of around 69 feet and the other at around 108 feet. And each of these voids were considerably larger than the burial chamber itself. However, there is no known passageway between the corridors of Khafre's pyramid leading down into either of these two voids. But these are not misreads of the scan data, and the voids are certainly there. Now, one very possible, perhaps likely explanation is that these are part of the labyrinths and cave systems that run beneath the Giza Plateau that connect back to the tombs of the northern cliffs that we discussed earlier. And I don't doubt that it may be possible that the Egyptians knew of other labyrinths and natural cave systems that could have connected to these very same caves beneath the Khafre Pyramid. Okay, so now we get to it. I have received dozens of messages of you guys wanting me to respond to and shed some light on these new Khafre scans that have absolutely taken the internet by storm. But I had felt that there was enough people out there who had covered this topic pretty thoroughly, and I didn't have much to add, so I didn't want to capitalize on the interest and just make a video parroting what everybody else had to say. I didn't feel that making a video solely focused on these new SARS Khafre scans was entirely necessary, but it dawned on me that this may be a perfect opportunity to address this while also shedding light on the greater Giza Plateau and the other features of the Giza Plateau that are subterranean and below the pyramids. But these recent scans can't go without mentioning. So within the last couple of weeks, a team of Italian scientists released a paper claiming to have detected an incredibly massive network of shafts with 2 large structures at a depth of more than 2 kilometers below the Khafre Pyramid. The technique behind the discovery is called synthetic aperture radar Doppler tomography. To put it simply, this is a type of technology that can be found installed on both planes and satellites and sends down pulses towards the Earth. And it uses the returning signal to create either 2D or 3D images of its readings. But this is almost never used to detect anything below the surface, as its subsurface readings are incredibly inaccurate. Perhaps it could go through 10 feet of fine sand before it hits solid bedrock and ends completely. Now, this radar was directed down towards the Giza Plateau, and the data received was interpreted as showing a massive structure below the Khafre Pyramid. So in a nutshell, this is what happened, but the controversy is not necessarily over their findings, but instead of how they represented their findings. When news of the radar data emerged, it was accompanied by these art concept images depicting duplicate King's Chamber and relieving chamber structures, which are found in the Great Pyramid, not in the Khafre Pyramid, superimposed onto the interior of Khafre's pyramid. They also depict more than 2-kilometer long vertical cylindrical shafts descending down into the Giza Plateau below Khafre's pyramid with winding staircases leading to 2 80-meter long chambers at the bottom, all of which are below Giza's water table. Aside from these problematic digital renderings, which may be dishonest at best, the main cause for concern here is that these new scans don't actually depict the interior chambers of Khafre's pyramid that we know exist, chambers that are in fact open to the public, let alone the 2 voids that I discussed earlier that were discovered back in the 1970s by the Stanford Research Institute. None of these known chambers and voids within Khafre's pyramid or below it are detected by this new 2025 scan. And for anybody questioning whether or not perhaps the 2025 scan is more accurate than the scan from the 60s and 70s, well, we know that those 60s and 70s scans were accurate because they tested the technology beforehand. They shot beams through the pyramid and they were able to detect all 4 corners of Khafre's pyramid, as well as the limestone casing covered peak on top of the pyramid. So they know that the technology works and they knew that it was accurate. But such cross-examination for this new SARS scan data has not been done. So we really have no reason to immediately believe what this research team is proposing or any of the data that they have proposed thus far. And when these propositions are being paired with these evocative digital renderings that hardly seem to accurately represent the scan images they've released, it seems to me like a team who is hoping to make headlines and pull in large amounts of funds rather than a legitimate and credible scientific finding. And not to mention that they censored and removed Matt Simpson of Ancient Architects' comments regarding his concerns on their scan data on their Facebook page. Any professional scientific organization that is censoring, silencing, or blocking people who are raising questions about their research is automatically open to an incredible amount of skepticism. My interpretation, at best, is that these scans are picking up messy data of extensive underground caverns beneath Khafre's pyramid, of which the Egyptians may very well have known were there, or perhaps even accessed at one point in time, as there are many more shafts and tunnels beneath Giza that Egyptologists claim have never been fully explored, if you believe that. There are many much more credible scan teams out there, such as the Scan Pyramids Project. This is the team that verifiably discovered the void above the entrance to the Great Pyramid, as well as the large, probably duplicate Grand Gallery above Khufu's Grand Gallery. The Scan Pyramids Project is much better equipped, much more trustworthy, and has a much longer track record than these new SARS guys, and are much more equipped to be able to prove or disprove claims like this. What I'm really looking forward to is seeing what the Scan Pyramids Project discovers when they finally send a camera into the void above the Grand underground gallery. Whatever found in there, if there's anything in there at all, whether it's hieroglyphs or some kind of artifact, whatever it is going to definitively prove who built the pyramids and perhaps even when. I truly think that the conversation, for the most part, could potentially end when this happens. It's not going to prove how they were built, but I think it is almost certainly going to close the case on who built the pyramids. There are so many more aspects to the Giza Plateau other than the three Great Pyramids. I sort of understood this prior to visiting Egypt, but nothing can replace that evocative, romantic, strong, visceral feeling of actually being there and seeing it for yourself. There's a difference between thinking you know and then knowing. You get an incomparable feel for the size, scale, and depth of the Giza Plateau, and the fact that it is riddled with shafts descending into the ground at every turn becomes cemented into your mind when you actually experience it. The allure of walking along the docks that were placed just outside the Valley Temple, where you can see that the ancient Nile would have run up to the Valley Temple. You would have, if you were a priest, or maybe even once a year during some kind of grand festival, a normal person would have had the privilege and the honor of stepping off of their riverboat onto the dock and walking into the Valley Temple with these huge cyclopean stones. Even just one stone can be the size of your average modern wall, going up 30 or 40 feet with these cross beams as the sun shoots down into the temple with this white calcite gleaming floor with these solid black diorite Khafre statues, people leaving offerings at, and walking out the back door of the Valley Temple and gazing over at the Sphinx. It's just incredibly evocative. All the while, beneath you is this huge web of interconnecting labyrinths and shaft tombs and tunnels and hallways beneath the ground. It is so endless. There's so much happening at the Giza Plateau other than the pyramids. When you've studied Egypt for long enough, the pyramids start to sort of fade away in the background as you sink your teeth into everything else that's around the pyramids, and gives context to who the people were that lived here at the footsteps of these pyramids, who the ancient Egyptians were. And that's another thing. I feel like in this space, it is not very popular or common for people to be genuinely interested in the ancient Egyptians themselves. And people tend to be disappointed when you tell them, well, listen, we still don't understand necessarily how all of these feats were achieved, but we do know who did them, and you can study the culture of these people and learn to understand them more. And perhaps the more you learn to understand them, you may be able to make individual discoveries that give you a greater insight into who these people were and why they achieved the things that they did, why they were able to achieve these things. I find that studying the daily life of regular people, sometimes even the royal court of Egypt, I mean, it's so popular, but I always like studying the regular person, whether it's the workmen or whether it's women or people living in town or how the government is run so long ago. I find these details to be so juicy and deep. And as you go down into studying these people and learning more about them, and then you gaze back at the pyramids, you get a better sense of what life was like in the ancient world and just how important the pyramids are. You get a sense that you wouldn't have had otherwise. And that's why I think that studying the Egyptians themselves is so important and is so necessary for anybody who is wrapped up in the allure of the mysteries around how they built the pyramids and what the pyramids were used for, whether they were, many people think a machine of some kind, or many people think a cult worshiping center. That's something in there is more so what I believe. I'm really into ancient mystery cults and ancient mystery schools and these sacred practices. It's just so obvious to me that everything beyond the 5th century in Greece, when you pass beyond the origins of the Western world, our minds that you and I have, where we are very impious people who look at the world and decide to take the world into our own hands. It's a very Western, it's a very modern first world country sort of mindset. These are not those people. These are people who were extremely pious and really, really cared about paying tribute and honoring and worshiping their gods. And their view of their world is entirely different than our own. And I find that diving into that is just so enriching and mysterious and deep. We talk about the unfinished obelisk that's down in the Aswan quarry, this 1,400-ton solid red Aswan granite obelisk that who knows how they were actually going to lift this thing. I mean, it's almost unimaginable. But there is a 350-ton obelisk that was erected by the pharaoh Hatshepsut at the beginning of the New Kingdom. And at the bottom, these perfectly defined, perfectly symmetrical Egyptian hieroglyphs detail why Hatshepsut erected 2 obelisks over the course of 7 months. She said that she did it like any good king would, spent an incredible amount of money to erect 2 massive megalithic obelisks as eternal gifts for the god Amun. These were acts of piety. These were gifts that were given to the god. These are very religious people who are doing things for some kind of deeper spiritual religious meaning, of which we don't really understand what the implications of that were. We don't really understand what ancient Egyptian religion was like. We don't really understand what the priesthood was like and how real and visceral their experiences were. Or I'll just say, I don't think that they were interacting with their gods in any kind of symbolic sense. I think these things were literally happening. It's the same way in ancient Greece. You have these women who are not figuratively, not metaphorically becoming possessed by the god and becoming an oracle. They are literally becoming possessed by the god. It's not symbolic or metaphorical in any way. It is literal. And I think that there's something deep and spiritual that's going on in the ancient world that we have got to escape our Western modern mindset to understand. And the last thing I'll say about this SARS Khafre scan, the ancient civilization, ancient mystery realm is very, very popular right now. And anybody who is feeding you information and visuals and images that seem like they are just tailor-made to fit the bill of the interest of people in this popular space, if somebody's feeding you what you want to hear, you should be cautious of this. This is something that you don't have to deal with on my channel. I constantly tell you guys things that you may not want to hear. When you come across a channel or when you come across a research team that tells you everything that you want to hear, they feed into every single popular idea, be wary, be skeptical of that, because selling mystery is easy and very profitable. Now, there's a lot of real mystery out there. It's what I spend every waking hour of my life studying, and it's what I make videos about. When you're watching my channel, this is all 100% real and honest, and I'm going to tell it to you like it is, whether you like it or not, and sometimes whether I like it or not. So if you'd like more videos like this on the ancient mysteries, history, and philosophy of ancient Egypt and Greece, well, I'm Luke Caverns. Please like and subscribe for more.